Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure welcoming Professor Tariq Islam for a session on overcoming the antinomy of interfaith dialogue. Tariq Islam is a retired professor and former chairman of the Department of Philosophy, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. He was schooled at the Oxford Grammar School, Oxford, UK, and graduated from the London Metropolitan University, London, with honors. He received his MPhil and PhD from AMU. He was appointed a lecturer in philosophy at the Aligarh Muslim University in 1981, and finally a professor. He retired in 2019. Professor Islam has several national and international publications to his credit and has participated and presented several national and international keynote addresses, papers, etc. He has been an elected member of the Executive Council of the Aligarh Muslim University, an ex-officio member of its Academic Council and Court. Professor Islam has been a member of the Council and Governing Body of the Indian Council of Philosophical Research. He has been an expert on several selection boards and an examiner at various levels at several universities. He has been the Honorary Treasurer of the Indian Philosophical Congress. Presently, he is working on a political reading of the Quran, his next book. You're welcome, Professor Islam. You have up to 3 hours for this session, but you can finish it early too if you wish. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I must first of all thank In Dialogue to find me suitable for this program. I'm extremely grateful. Yeah, let's see how long the discussion actually continues to be interesting. That will determine how long it goes on. Yeah. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see a lot of you joining in. My lecture today, and please, before I start off, please do not mind because I might keep fiddling with my earphones because I'm not very used to them. So please do not mind that. The lecture today that I intend to deliver is, I've titled it Overcoming the Antinomy of Interfaith Dialogue. You may find it to be slightly maybe off track, but let's see what the response would be like, okay? There are several ideas that actually intermesh into this little lecture. Okay, so let me start by stating the obvious, or let's say the very obvious. We are at a perplexed moment in human freedom. Perplexed moment of human freedom. What I mean by that is that, how and to what extent and where, what kind of freedom can possibly be there? Okay, that's a question that is very pertinent at the moment. Let me just tell you that I'm primarily a man of political philosophy. And I tend to look at everything in political terms. So you'll excuse me for that as well. We see an intellectual and economic outburst which threatens to reduce the hegemonic West, a crisis of civilizations or end of history, an end in sight for an era, but distant in coming around. There's an unprecedented cynicism of the political reflected by the prevailing disenchantment exhibited through periodic outbursts of public agitations. And we see them right across the world, starting from Arab Spring to the present day. Even today, the number of places globally which are disturbed, with agitations. There's a disenchantment that is actually starting to settle down. It hasn't fully settled down because there's not the kind of massive reaction that is expected from disenchantment of this caliber This may be because most of the defining characteristics of modernity, actually the defining characteristics of modernity come from its very early history, especially the European state system, including the liberal democratic, the overemphasis of reason and science leading to capital accumulation, and an exclusionary Weltanschauung, which was constructed to establish and maintain Western dominance. We today pretend to be living in a postmodern world, searching and redefining the boundaries that require not only rethinking the normative and cognitive, but also revisiting the past, necessitating, negotiating, and navigating the right course to sustain ourselves. I call it a misnomer. So the misnomer globalization or liberalization, the neoliberal ascendancy. And I call that because I, obviously have a different perspective on neoliberalism anyway, is the claim of withering away, which will come through as background to this lecture. See, this globalization, liberalization is the claim of withering away of borders, in contrast to Marx's withering away of the state. The benefits of the claims are obvious. I need not go into any great details here. However, it is important to note the contradiction in the mere fact that while borders have gone porous for trade and financial engagements and transactions, the people are subjected to more intensely subjected to identities, and their movement made more and more difficult each day. So obviously it's a very restricted kind of liberalization. I mean, liberalization only gets up to financial and economic situations and nothing more than that. The identity conflicts have grown sharper with each passing decade. However, a virus can manage, expands, that's what we are witnessing at the moment, manage, expands, while gathering speed with an ease not heard of before. But the human being finds it very difficult to move around. However, there is a rapidity in the changing character of society, economy, and environment, impressing a construction of a multi-religious speciality as conflict resolution. The antagonisms have grown enormously to the extent of even organizing interfaith dialogues, which were otherwise, if at all, natural processes. The interfaith dialogue, while claiming an intent of accommodating the other, is somewhat exclusionary from my point of view. And I'll get reasons for that. The antinomy embedded in it, okay, somewhat exclusionary, the antinomy embedded in it. Firstly, it establishes dialogue only among the religious, excluding a large section of global society comprising non-religious population. But I'm not going to go into that in this particular lecture. Secondly, and which is what we are going to deal with basically, is that most probably, unwittingly though, it in its strict sense primarily indicates Semitic religions, which places the approach as Orientalist, typified by its exclusionary tendency. However, there is definitely an Orientalist imitative phase that is attached to the notion. We need to overcome it and start a discourse more significant and relevant to multi-religious societies like India and other countries. Let me clarify that I'm not decrying the endeavor to continue engaging ourselves in dialogues, as only such an engagement can teach us to tolerate the differences and get away from an effort to homogenize and hegemonize. My contention is that we can overcome the antinomies if we adopt interreligious understanding instead of interfaith dialogue. The global socio-political churning, especially in India, West Asia, United States, United Kingdom, etc., affecting all of us equally, dictates the adoption of proposed terminology. I therefore prefer interreligious understanding as a nomenclature. The lexicographic preference is based on the feeling that in vogue nomenclature interfaith has a clear undertone of Orientalism. The historical origin and development of the notion of interfaith is interesting, and I would like to bring that before you, which is important to consider as it reveals the antinomy. The first use of the term interfaith is to be found sometime in 1932. Now that year is significant. It is the year that Huxley's dystopia, Brave New World, saw the light of the day. The year that saw Gandhi arrested by the British. The year of surge of fascism with the fascist coup in Memel territory, now Lithuania. The rise of Adolf Hitler. The year that saw high unemployment, etc. These are the features of that year in which interfaith actually started to come up as a terminology, as a terminology. The graph of the use of the term shows a rise till 1960, when there's a nosedive decline till 1979. These were the decades of rise of employment. So when there's unemployment, this kind of terminology does its job. But with the decline in unemployment, rise of employment, which is what we see around 60s and then maybe late 60s and maybe 1979, up to 1970, these were the decades of rise of employment, the spread of liberal and socialist thought, the age of secularization. However, interestingly, but not surprisingly, the use of the term starts to rise again and still rising. Now, this is what I want to draw an analogy. This is where I want to draw an analogy. The efforts to put, surprising, the use of the term starts to rise again and is still rising. The use has gone up by 300% since 1979, a huge rise in use. When the global trend towards neoliberal policies started, the efforts to put into motion the notion of globalization and liberalization started to gain strength. The full impact of oil nationalization of 1973 took hold in 1979, affecting foreign policies of the Western nations. The event of September 11, 2001 has added impetus to the use and utility of the term interfaith, as pretends to strike at the heart of religious conflicts. I need to mention which religions, the clash of civilizations, and resolve them through dialogue. I need not mention which religions, we know that. The history apart, the use of interfaith has some serious philosophical drawbacks, which helps in concluding that interfaith and its use is either a covert political project or otherwise suffers from being an extremely limited project. In either case, the project is not beyond suspicion that needs to be addressed. I will take up as sample the two leading philosophers in the 1990s, viz. Derrida and Habermas, who disagreed with each other, especially with regard to methodology emanating from an approach inherited from the antiquities of choice between dialectics and rhetoric. However, before doing that, we must first interrogate whether Hinduism is a faith, is Sikhism a faith, is Jainism a faith? What is the term faith used for? It is difficult to categorically assert these as faiths: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and other world religions such as Confucianism, secular humanism, and the traditions of ethnic peoples. Okay, these are basically the things that we should be actually dealing with. These ethical Weltanschauung to make possible a continuing engagement with ethics, if we look at it as a totality. Georg Habermas proposes full participation in political life and civil society. He suggests an understanding of the plurality of voices while retaining the backdrop of reason. Habermas points out, and I'm just quoting Habermas here, the philosophically enlightened self-understanding of modernity stands in a peculiar dialectical relationship to the theological self-understanding of the major world religions, which intrude into this modernity as the most awkward element from its past. The intrusion is not to be condemned, but placed in a perspective of debate, dialogue, and understanding. Derrida, one cannot force someone to speak. or to listen. This is where the question of faith returns. According to Dredha, there is a difference between religion and faith. Faith is the condition of social relations, intersubjectivity, and this is where I'm going to lay the stress, intersubjectivity, the commonality, enabling addressing the other. In understanding a huge space, opens up for both difference and commonality, and empathy and compassion for the other. Dredha insists, I do not see what the other has in mind or whether the other wants to deceive me. So I have to trust the other. That is faith. Faith is blind. And Habermas agrees. Faith, in a somewhat slightly different manner, faith remains opaque for knowledge in a way which may neither be denied nor simply accepted. That is a quote from Habermas. If we understand faith purely as a theological notion, then there is no possibility of an opening required for inclusion. There's a closure. Faith in these philosophical terms is nobody's monopoly, and this is philosophy. The faith is shared meaning. Faith, in other words, cannot be confined to religious discourse. Faith then may firstly be classified as a feature of commonality and one that is peculiar. But then what we are going to do, if we do that and we understand it as commonality, as something that is there, we are maybe in this kind of academic setup trivializing the very notion of faith itself. Okay, so I'm going to steer away from it. The ordinary common meaning of the faith is what I'm going to steer away from, okay, which is what Dredha is basically pointing to. Okay, faith then may first be classified as a feature of commonality and one that is particular and not a physical notion confining it to religion. The ordinary common meaning of faith and the meaning in metaphysics of religion are easily discernible. The former forms the backbone of social intersubjectivity, our main concern. And the latter, the religious subjectivity, the urgency in differentiating the two must also be recognized. Secondly, I have mentioned earlier, interfaith has an exclusionary tone. I'm not the only one insisting. The website of Archdiocese of Chicago, under the heading, What is the difference between economical and interreligious relations, defines the term interfaith as concerned with relations of members of the Abrahamic religions. It goes on to enumerate interreligious as relations with other religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism. It is to Abrahamic tradition that the term faith is mostly applied. The term faith then is applicable only to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This limitation in the discourse is unwarranted, undesirable, and exclusionary, and it may only serve the purposes of the West, where mainly these religions prevail. But for pluralistic, multi-religious societies such as India, there is a need to stretch further, and while giving up the imitation, start to talk of and look for interreligious understanding. However, after the European Enlightenment and its accompanying narrative of modernity, the faith of the secular state started to appear on the European scene. The preliminary requirement of the secular fabric was separation of religion from the regulatory function of the state. In other words, the separation of the political from the religious. The separation had to be absolute. Now, this is important. The separation between religion and the political had to be absolute. Otherwise, the very primary goal of the project would have met its end at its very inception. The absoluteness required the pushing of the religious to the private sphere or space. The public sphere was cordoned off or enclosed for the state and its functioning. I must immediately clarify that I'm not at any time proposing a combination of the political and religious, but am proposing its separation. I'm suggesting that the manner of separation of the religious and the political in the liberal society has brought a complete divorce of religion from public discourse, leaving discursive discourse on religion little room to develop interreligious understanding. And if you do not mind me say it, therefore, inserting the artificiality of interfaith. It is this resultant exclusiveness that became and is the cause of conflict. I may be permitted to say that these conflicts are not only interreligious, but also intra-religious, between the sects within a religion. Therefore, an intra-religious understanding is as important, if not at times more important, within a religious community. The problematic can be constructed as a difference between belongingness and exclusiveness, like in Tagore's notion of cosmopolitanism, where one's immediate surroundings are initial in terms of response, but without ignoring the cosmopolitical at any time. Tagore's cosmopolitanism suggests that while carrying the cosmopolitical notion, the local immediate surroundings are to be addressed as initial response. In a similar fashion, one's religion is the initial response, but keeping in mind all the time or emanating from an interreligious understanding to be developed or developing or evolved or evolving. There has to be some deliberativeness in the matter, and therefore an urgency that requires the interreligious understanding to be developed and not wait for it to evolve. The need is an increasingly turbulent and fragmented world, in an increasingly turbulent and fragmented world is even more so loud today for an understanding to develop between communities, ethnicities, and cultures. The technological developments resulting in quick travel, greater mobility for an even greater number of people, and with it, the ever intermingling of religious communities and identities, it is fast becoming a trend to have multi-religious spaces in public places such as hospitals, universities, airports, etc., designed to fulfill the need of global religious plurality. And you have these separate rooms for praying, which are shared by all religions. But this involves bringing religion out of its modernist phase of privacy into public space, and discursive discourse leading to what Habermas terms as post-secular society. We have limited religion to private space, the multi-religious space, which obviously is not sufficient. Habermas proposes the conditions for these post-secular societies. The religious side must accept the authority of natural reason as fallible, result of the institutionalized sciences and the basic principles of universalistic egalitarianism in law and morality. Conversely, secular reason may not set itself up as the judge concerning truths of faith, even though in the end it can accept as reasonable only what it can translate into its own, in principle, universally accessible discourses. There's a need to provide a framework to turn the antinomy into fruitful exchanges among competing identities, religious, ethnic, etc. The dialogical individual or collectivity should feel the perpetual need to converse with each other rather than speak about each other. So what you need to do is to speak to each other rather than speaking about each other. Interreligious understanding is a possibility of post-secular mode where religion is given entry to public discourse, discursive discourse, opening up an equal space for both commonality and difference to discover the other. And, or let's put it another way, I won't keep saying the other, each other. We have to discover each other. We have to move away from the antagonistic to the agonistic relations, a proposal by radical democracy proponents such as Lacklow and Moff. To engage in such conversation, one requires that people speak, and just as importantly, that they listen. Khatami, former Iranian president, voiced, understanding results from talking and listening. And the two functions of talking and listening are the most important physical, psychological, and spiritual activity of human being. And I'm quoting this. Understanding is an encounter across cultures, religions and civilizations, where one listens to the other, opens up, gets sensitive, and even get exposed to the other's ideas, perspectives, and above all, worries. Through understanding, by conversing with the other, there is the discovery of the other. And therefore, I think that interreligious understanding is the principle that we should actually be working on. And I prefer that particular principle in comparison to interfaith. Okay, I'll just finish there. That's how much I would like to say. So we can always get into an interactive session.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. Now we open the floor for questions and answers. Anybody with any comment to pose?
I hope that the paper is not, the lecture is not too philosophical, but then that's my fate. And hope that I have drawn the distinction between interfaith and interreligious clearly enough, you know, because basically what we are working at is, I mean, let's say I'm in the effort, should be that there should be an understanding, and see, not only in at this level, but also at the level of, I mean, even at the level of democracy itself, you know, because democracy, I mean, this is something that is interesting to note. See, democracy's first principle is egalitarianism, equality for all, which obviously is basically a Christian tenet, okay, because God made them all equal. Okay, that kind of notion comes and translates itself into political discourse. And secondly, because basically what you've got here is, first of all, this equality, and the second is obviously freedom of speech. Now, the two things combined together, okay, I do not lay stress on what I'll call let's say equality part, okay, the egalitarian part. What I lay stress on is the freedom of speech, that is dissent, okay? And dissent is also important for understanding, because if you do not disagree, if you do not allow dissent, if you are not willing to listen to the other, then what kind of an understanding, what kind of a relationship, what kind of a dialogue are we going to develop? Are we not going to miss out on a huge part of this world? Because the whole thing is to listen, to understand, to dialogue, to converse, to speak, okay? But not from one single perspective, but from perspective of trying to understand, to intermingle, to combine, okay, to be sympathetic, etc., okay? So it's not only at the level of faith and religion as such, but also at the democratic level. And dissent is important, because dissent, and this is what we are going to, I hope, and I mean, at least, I mean, this something is becoming slightly more clearer. Dissent and resistance is finally going to be the mode of governance itself. And that is important. Now, I'm bringing this in primarily because I think that if you're going to have some kind of a, let us say, interfaith dialogue or interreligious understanding, then obviously dissent, okay, and is going to be essential. And tolerating of dissent is going to be essential. Because if you don't do that, I mean, you have to, you should have the right to criticize other and be criticized at the same time. You should be ready to be criticized as well. You should be ready that people should disagree with you. You should be ready to tolerate it. And that's why I bring in this very notion of agonism as compared to antagonism. So we should actually be working at not antagonizing as such. We should actually be working at agonizing. Okay, and agonizing is basically going to develop an understanding. It's going to develop a feeling for the other. It's going to develop a feeling that the other is not the other, but us. And that's what's going to bring in the understanding that we basically propose through any interfaith dialogue. Okay? Yeah, any questions? Any comments?
Yes, Surusa. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your presentation. It was quite wonderful to listen to you. So could you like possibly shed some more light on, I mean, your understanding of when you said, I mean, a post-secular society? Because I have really not been able to make sense of this word as such. I mean, what does it essentially mean? I mean, if we move away from the theory, not speaking in the sense of the words, but if we speak in sense of its practicality, how would you describe it? I mean, I would essentially understand it theoretically. Maybe it would probably mean where both the religious as well as the secular has the same theoretical grounding, at least theoretically speaking. But I've not been able to understand it in the practical sense. Like, how can we probably visualize it? Or how do you visualize it? Like, if you could just share some more light.
Yeah, okay. See, post-secular society obviously is a notion that is coming from Habermas. Okay, he's the proponent of the idea of post-secular society. See, in post-secular society, you're expecting, in practical terms, that, I mean, these restrictions, okay, I mean, let's put it this way, of religion and its movements and religious movings, okay, religion crossing boundaries, borders, you know, crossing communities, you know, these things in a post-secular society are going to disappear, because then religion is not confined to this private space where I and you sit somewhere in our little private, let's say, space, and we start to actually deliberate only among ourselves. Okay, nothing beyond that. We are going, I mean, religion is going to be brought out back into the public space, where there would be an openness, there would be a discussion. Why should religion, which obviously is governs so, see, okay, let's get back to another notion. Basically, I mean, what I understand by religion, and this is something that I've been working on, thinking about for quite some time, is that let us not shy away. I mean, you know this, Islam is under attack from one particular angle, that it is primarily political. Okay, to the extent of even being politically violent. Okay, now the thing is that all religion is political. What is political? Political primarily is the organization of the society. Now religion does organize the society. So if it is organizing the society, why confine it to a space? Let every religion come out and try and organize, which obviously it has done in history. Let it come out. I mean, if you look at the Indian history, you'll find it even more so, because this is a place where multiple, let us say, religious understandings coexisted. So what you're getting basically is that each one is presenting itself without any boundaries, where you suggested, okay, so you cannot step beyond that. Why can you not step beyond? Why can't you get into a discursive discourse on it? Why can't you not tolerate the, let us say, the religion or the view of somebody else? Why can't you do that? Why these boundaries? Why can't we move away? This is what post-secular society primarily requires, that we move religion into the place that it was there earlier, because that is something that is created by liberal philosophy. Okay, and it is liberal democracy, which is actually, because liberal democracy works on a simple notion of division. So obviously it's going to start off dividing the space as well into private and public. That's one division of space. Obviously there are other divisions like working spaces and home spaces and these spaces and that spaces, okay? But you know, these kind of things. So basically it works on division. So it's dividing that as well. Taking religion into the private is then dividing the religions themselves among themselves. There's all these conflicts that are occurring between themselves because they're not allowed to come out into a discursive discourse openly, you know, into the public space. They are confined. You keep your religion to yourself and that's the end of it. Okay, academia apart. I'm not suggesting that the academia does not go into these kind of deliberations, and obviously these kind of deliberations are getting more and more popular by the day. But post-secular society wants it to be something that is open, okay? That is not something that is confined to these spaces of academia and all that, but be open, you know, just and have equal right to try and organize society.
So at best, we can say that it would be essentially the best possible situation where you will be able to, you know, transcend that boundary between your public and your private, and you are able to have that space where you need not be worried about accommodating what you think depending on what the other person thinks. But will that not be like, I mean, I'm not sure if as humans we would be necessarily that accommodating when we are talking about something which has such a personal bearing, because we are saying that, you know, we are bringing the private into the public. So how can we, like, because wouldn't that then be...
Sure. When you say personal, I immediately recall the slogan, the feminist slogan, that personal is political. Okay, I'm deliberately using the word private. I'm not using the word personal. Okay, because private is a very strong boundary. All right, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being personal. Personal is very political anyway. But anyway, there's no problem as far as personal is concerned, because there are no such strict boundaries there. You know, in the private there is strict, solid boundaries. Okay, that do not allow you to cross over. All right. So we want to finish off those boundaries. Why not? Why should we not? Why should we not be able to discuss it openly, without fear, without any you know, I mean, kind of apprehension that, you know, something ugly might turn out of it. You know, that's one situation that we're facing at the moment. You know, why can't we come out of all that? That we can only come out provided it comes into the public space, the post-secular society. So we need to go beyond that secularism that has been given to us by liberal democracy. We need to, or let's say liberalism, I should not use the word democracy, liberalism. Okay, liberal philosophy has given us that kind of confinement as such. So why can't we just move out, move beyond that? Okay, sufficient. I'm not suggesting at any point that in history we did not require such a inhibition. Maybe we did. I'm not calling that into question. But I'm saying that now, today, in today's world, we need to move beyond that. We need to go beyond that, because history is a kind of cyclic thing, you know. So we need to go into this religious thing again, but in a more modified, in a more mature, because we are more mature human beings now than we were, let us say, 2,000 years ago, or 2,500 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, you know. So we can deliberate on it without getting into huge conflicts.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Quite interesting. Helps you to elaborate. Yeah. Let's have some more.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for your session. Like, thank you for your speeches and all. Actually, sir, I have questions. Like, as we talk about identity crisis.
Yeah.
So, like, this kind of issues is going everywhere. Like, either it is culture or religion, there is some kind of crisis is going on. That's why there is also revival of religion and culture and language. Like, around the world, something is going on related to revival of religion. So what is the role of globalization and liberalization in this kind of, like, in this identity crisis? Like, how globalization and liberalization is affecting the identity, and then there's a resurgence of identity a revival kind of issues going on, or revival of religion agenda is going on around the world. Even right-wing parties is emerging in many countries, even in India and Europe. So, like, is it because of the impact of globalizations and liberalizations, or if it is the reason, then how it is affecting?
Okay,
Like, I just want to comment.
Yeah, sure. Let me just put this into a slightly maybe different perspective. See, whenever financial crisis is bigger, okay, or grows, all right. Now, what do we mean by financial crisis growing? Basically, what we mean is that finance is getting accumulated, it is getting centralized, and it's getting more and more centralized. All right. Now, what we have here in form of globalization, I mean, liberalization is a total nutter misnomer. I've said that in my lecture. What's actually going on with the IMF? Okay, these kind of international financial institutes which have come up by themselves, right? They're not something that belong to a particular country or does not belong to the people as such, or we have not decided that there should be such organizations, but where have they come from? They have come from this effort, okay, to basically centralize finance further and further. And that's what it is doing. That is what it's making. See, the interesting thing in this, and you should remember this, the next market would be Africa. Okay, let's put it this way. Hegel was interesting on this. Hegel actually said in his political philosophy, he has argued that what we are getting basically is industrialization. I mean, there was some industrialization that was coming up. What we're getting I'm rephrasing the entire thing. What we're getting is industrialization. That is, the production is going up. Production of goods is going up. So what actually happens, and this is something that Hegel visualized, he argued that what will happen is that there'll come a stage when the internal markets, that the home markets will actually get saturated. Then obviously these very people who are actually producing the goods, because they are unrestricted, okay, this is what liberalization is, because they are unrestricted in it, therefore what they're going to do, they're going to look for markets beyond their borders, okay? And this is what globalization and liberalization primarily is. It's the big world capitalists looking for other markets going across the borders. That's why I said in my lecture that what we find is porous borders for financial engagements, economic engagements, but nothing beyond that, okay? Now, this basically is what liberalization and globalization is. The very notion that you've got markets elsewhere which can be captured. So now today, what we find is not just simply this kind of thing where you're just capturing the market, but the thing that we are getting, and this is what's growing over history, is that the big money lies somewhere where it actually lends you out. You go out into the market, you try and buy a car. What happens? The car company itself offers a loan, or it at least says, okay, I'll get somebody to give you a loan. It will even be interest-free. So what's going on? What's going on is that the people who've got the money in their hand are actually loaning it out in order to buy the goods manufacturing. Okay, but obviously at the same time reaping off their. So what we're getting, like for example in India, at particular time, I mean, India restricted the currency movement. All right. Now, one thing that IMF wanted before 1990s and kept stressing that, and we went up to 1990 when liberalization actually came through, was that they opened up the currency. Anybody could bring in their cash money in here and they can take their money out. All right. So what happened to them because of that? What happened because of that is that a lot of multinational companies moved in. And what did these look at? I mean, let's move away from it a little bit now. I mean, even Trump actually came up with the idea that they're going to restrict this outsourcing. Why? You are the one who actually proposed it in the first place. Then why are you restricting it now? Okay. So what we're getting to see is that there's this big capitalist, okay, and one of the persons who's there behind the entire idea of IMF is Rutherford. All right. So basically, these people have come together at a particular place. Also, they are in competition with each other, but then to serve their interests as something that is common between them, they actually combine together and form these kind of institutes. So loan comes out to India from IMF, and then IMF starts to lay down its conditions. And the conditions are that you allow everything so that exploitation can be to its extreme, to its maximum. And that's why I'm saying that today we are witnessing Asia as a market. Soon Asia is going to develop. And then obviously the next market, the only market that will be left will be Africa. Okay, so at a particular point, like Francis Yokohama said, who I disagree with intensely, but at least I agree with him in one thing. After 1989 fall of the Soviet Union, he actually claimed that this is the end and the beginning of universalization of democracy, except for a few parts. I mean, we have virtually universalized democracy. I think what he was talking about is not universalized democracy, maybe to a certain extent, but then democracy goes hand in hand. The liberal democracy, I'm not talking about all democracies, liberal democracy goes hand in hand. It's a ground, it's where basically capitalism breeds well. Okay, the best place for it to breed. So basically what he's basically suggesting is that democracy is universalized. That means capitalism is going to move around wherever it likes. It has free access to everything. Obviously, in this, you follow the Soviet Union bloc actually shows that. Okay, that is basically was a signal that, okay, the capital can move around wherever it wants. Capital should not be restricted. That was the whole idea. So Fukuyama said that democracy is going to universalize. What I think that is universalizing is not democracy in the true sense of the word that I've been using earlier. Democracy primarily means dissent. Democracy means tolerating of differences. Democracy means equality. And equality, I do not mean just equality before law, but beyond that, the real equality. Okay? Democracy requires freedom of speech. Okay, those things are slowly disappearing. I mean, I think there was far greater of these things in 1960s than it is there today. All right, I do not know how many of your students are actually there. Obviously, virtually none who were there in 1960s. Obviously, I myself was a young child at that time, but I do recall all that. In 1970s, very good. You know, I could see that because I was then in a school and then I moved on to the university. And obviously you can go around saying what you like. I mean, in the academia, express whatever views you have, there would be absolutely no problem. But today, in expressing those views, you are getting into problems. There are problems hanging around everywhere. You cannot do that. I mean, there are all kinds of accusations. There's this pointing of fingers. And this is where liberal democracy basically is. Liberalism cannot survive without having an enemy to point at. Now, neoliberalism and globalization being a process in centralization of capital basically leads to fascism. And that is what we are witnessing today in this world. We are witnessing a rise in fascism. Okay, this is what happened during Adolf Hitler's time as well. Germany was competing with Britain primarily to hegemonize the world market and through industrialization. Okay, so similar kind of thing is witnessed today as well. History is repeating itself. Okay, although it is in a modified and a much higher level. So therefore, what we could see around 1950s and 60s quite clearly coming through, we do not see it because capital has hidden itself, concealed itself very well. It's too difficult to penetrate it. Yeah, am I clear on that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Nitya, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much, sir.
Is it possible for you to turn on the camera, Nitya? Can you do that?
No, actually, I am not in that position.
Okay.
If you, I really pardon me for that. But, sir, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really quite politically and philosophically loaded, and I think I would really require time to process it even more deeply. So, one question that's coming that I want to seek out is this clarification. Are you trying to suggest somewhere that interreligious as a terminology is more suitable than interfaith? Because faith, ontologically speaking, it's quite contestable. I mean, every faith comes in so many forms, and it can also be problematized because it can easily be pitted against science when it comes to rationality, whereas religion as an organized subset of practice is somewhat like a fertile ground to identify and also to engage in a dialogue with. So, this is one clarification I wanted to ask. Are you suggesting that? And the second is that also, if you can elaborate a bit more on the difference between dialectic and rhetoric, and how do we understand it through what discourse in terms of religion? Yeah, so like I was also reading this political psychoanalyst called Valmik Volkan, and what you said rightly, that that somewhere even Freud suggested that it's so important to understand the basics of human nature, and Volkan proposes this tendency that we all have to unconsciously a need to have enemies and allies. So somewhere this understanding of faith, because it comes with a source of knowledge and so different also in oriental or indigenous occult practices for that matter. So faith perhaps cannot be contested, but at the level of religion we can engage in a dialogue better. So is that what are you trying to convey through your paper? Yeah, so
Yes,
just clarification.
yes,
Thank you.
yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to convey. I'm happy that you have actually asked this question, because that basically gives me an indication that I've actually reached the audience a little bit, okay? See, what I'm arguing through this, and this is my contention primarily, is that if we work at something called interfaith, then I have already said that there are two angles to it. One that I just left for the time being, I thought that maybe we can discuss that later or somewhere like that, is that obviously this basically interfaith, and see, let's put it this way. The way that I've distinguished it is basically that I've lent on Dreya, and I think that might be the case. Because, I mean, basically faith is trusting the other, all right? Now, that is the trivial use, the common use of the word faith. I have faith on you. Okay, that's one way of saying it. But then faith, the way that it is used in interfaith, is something entirely different. That the meaning there is entirely different. The connotations there are entirely different. The connotations are, as I've said in this lecture, they're basically that you're dealing with some kind of a religion. Okay, now what is that religion? That religion is basically the three religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity. Okay, they're Abrahamic faith, religions, basically. That's why I said that let's pit Buddhism and Sikhism and Jainism, all those against it, I mean, I don't count Hinduism as a religion. Hinduism is not a religion, okay? Basically, you've got, what is it called? I mean, there's some other name, for that religion, but I mean, Hinduism is not a religion. Hinduism is a kind of an umbrella cover for multiple kind of understanding of reality and multiple kind of going along with that reality. Okay, it's not some particular kind of a faith as such. Okay, none of these religions, be that Sikhism, be that Buddhism, be that Jainism, they're not faiths, they're religions, they're a way of life, nothing more than that. There's no requirement for them to pray. There's no requirement for them to believe that there's some deity beyond this world, etc., etc. All those things are minus as far as these religions are concerned. But then obviously there's a difference between religion and faith then. Okay, in this sense, faith requires something beyond, okay, something that is metaphysical, okay? Whereas religion does not necessarily require, and that's why I call religion political, because religion basically is a way of life that is organizing the society in a particular manner, okay? That is what basically religion is doing. So I differentiate between the two, okay, in this sense. And therefore, I think that having an interreligious understanding could be far more fruitful than having an interfaith dialogue. Okay, because that is very restrictive and exclusionary in its very vision. From my point of view, I might be wrong. I'm open to being corrected on this. But this is my view, okay, that is basically exclusionary because you're restricting yourself. Religions are multiple. I mean, there are lots of religions in this world, not just one. I mean, there have been plenty of religions in history as well. All right. So, and which have just withered away or disappeared altogether. But I mean, this is something that is there. So why not have interreligious understanding instead of interfaith? Okay, that's one thing. Second thing, I mean, I don't agree with Freud. All right, the way that he places the very notion of human nature, because I personally feel that there is no such thing as human nature. Okay, I cannot find one single trend or one particular characteristic which is common among all human beings. So how can you possibly talk about having human nature? Human nature is only an abstraction. It is only an abstraction, nothing more than that. But then we have to ask the question, abstraction from what? Abstraction from the society that we are basically living in, because that's the only place that we can possibly have an abstraction. Okay, so if that is the society, then the society is basically what is actually giving us the human nature that we are talking about. It's making us into what we are. So let's put it this way. If we are in a religious society, we are religious. If we are in a capitalist society, we are capitalists. Okay, if we are in a socialist society, we are socialists. Okay, so society is basically, I'm not suggesting that in any society there's a kind of a closure. There are exceptions, and the society itself gives room for these exceptions, because otherwise it will be defuncted, you know, altogether. I mean, exceptions if are not allowed, then obviously the society is going to become very insular and it'll die its own death. So basically, what is human nature? There's no such thing as human nature or universal human nature. There's no such thing. Human nature primarily indicates what the society of the time, the kind of problems that we have at the time, the kind of sympathies, the empathies, etc., that we have the time, they actually create you. They create your yearnings, they create your urges, they create your requirements, they create your needs, etc., Everything is created by the society itself. Okay, I mean, and again, I'm going to say that does not mean that everybody's trapped into it. There are lots of people who escape, and that's what makes them great. That's where great people actually come from. They escape their conditions. They get away from their social conditions. They can think beyond those social conditions and think in terms of maybe other possibilities, because they are not satisfied with the society. They are not satisfied with the way that they're being made by the society. They rebel from it. They move away from it. Take anybody, I mean, any great thinker, any great painter, any great musician, any great man as such, they move away. All right, is that okay? So I prefer that interreligion or interreligious understanding should actually be the target, rather than an interfaith dialogue that is very restrictive. Am I clear on that?
Yes, sir, absolutely. Thank you very much. So also if you can just elaborate a bit on rhetoric and
Oh, yes,
dialect.
sorry, I forgot that. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Yeah. See, Greek history, I mean, unlike, I can talk about Indian history. See, in Indian history, you've got this conflict between the Charvak and the Vedic people. All right. But then Charvak is not something that is dominated by reason as such. Okay. Their first requirement is not reason. But what they're basically suggesting is that, certain amount of reason should always be there before we can go out. Okay. Vedic people are suggesting that there should be no reason. Okay. There's the Vedas and you're supposed to follow it. Now, this is what we find in the Greek antiquities as well. So there's a kind of, let's say, quarrel, which starts off. And if you don't mind me going into a slight elaboration of the history of philosophy, see the very first Greek philosophers were materialists. Or let's say physicalists. I won't call them materialists, let's call them physicalists, okay? And it was only with Pythagoras that we actually started to see certain level of idealism. Now, idealism is primarily a theory which says that there's something beyond the physical. Okay, that's what idealism is basically. So Pythagoras came up with this notion that numbers, number theory, which he says that number is what actually makes up the world, okay? So obviously, and then they went in for this occult practices and all that, and they had their own little churches and all that going on, okay? Now, after that, what we got is basically Heraclitus, who actually came up with this notion that there is what might be called dialectical reasoning. Dialectics is slightly different from ordinary reasoning in that it actually takes in the opposite, okay, the of and its opposite, and the combination of the two and the resultant of that. So it keeps moving in this kind of triadic, there's a triadic movement, okay? Now, with Socrates, Plato, we start to see this kind of tussle between the rhetoric, okay? What is rhetoric? Rhetoric is basically where you're using metaphors to incite certain kind of feelings to move. I mean, like, for example, politicians most of the time are using rhetoric. Now, that was Plato, and Socrates and Plato following him decried this kind of a use, okay? They suggested that everything should be laid bare, it should be in, in a logical manner, etc., rather than actually using. Now, there were people who argued, no, rhetoric is important because it actually gets you a better understanding. It gets across quicker. Okay, there are symbols, there are metaphors, no doubt, and obviously these matters are restricted to cultures. Obviously they are. But then, I mean, why should we break this up? We should try and understand other cultures, and we can understand their metaphors to whatever extent. And therefore, I mean, what happens in literature is when you come down to translation is interesting, because translation is not possible. Translation, I mean, there are people who translate, but translation is never possible for the simple reason that you cannot translate metaphors. You cannot translate idioms. Okay, so rhetoric occurs within idioms. Okay, within metaphors that are prevalent. Okay, reason tries to go beyond that. And that is the difference between that, or let's put it another way, which is what we are getting in postmodern discourse, discursive discourse at the moment, is that reason itself is a rhetoric. It itself uses metaphors. Okay, it is not something that is as simple as this, I mean, it is. I mean, reason, or what is the outcome of that rationality? Reason or rationality is what actually led to the building up of colonialism. That is what actually, colonialism, not in sense of occupying some other country, but colonialism in the sense that you do not only go and occupy it, but you colonize the place and colonize the mind of the people. So obviously the British coming down to India would start to argue that these are wild people, they're uncivilized people. We're trying to civilize them. We're trying to give them reason. Look at them, they run around, they don't even have clothes to wear, that kind of nonsense, Okay, this is reasoning to certain people. But then I feel that this is just as much as rhetoric. Postmodern philosophers actually think that this is also rhetoric. So they look at reason not only in terms of of the way that it is being used, but they are basically accusing reason itself of rhetoric. Or let's put it another way. They're saying that we need a different kind of reasoning altogether. This reasoning is not good enough. Okay, we need some kind of reasoning. So reason and rhetoric are in opposition, in contradiction to each other. All right. Reason is something that is primarily based on logic. Rhetoric is supposed to move away from logic and convey the meaning in its nakedness. Okay, rather than in the garb of a particular kind of language. That's the difference between the two.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really insightful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for asking the question. That was interesting. I think that did require a certain amount of clarity. Yeah, sure.
Anybody else?
Okay, why can't we get a response from the students? And I mean, let's see. I mean, how do they look at religion as such, as an ontological category? Let's get some response on that, can we? Or let's put it this way: are there certain hesitations in that? Because if there are some hesitations, then I'm right. Interreligious understanding is the requirement of the day. No responses on that. Okay, let's put it another way. I mean, let's have some response on the prevalent situation, the world global situation at the moment. I mean, do we not find ourselves somewhat hemmed in, you know, somewhat restricted, somewhat apprehensive in airing our views?
Thank you.
Please. Yeah.
I think I won't be able to reflect much, but I think we are afraid. Maybe sometimes we are afraid of being misunderstood, and sometimes we are afraid of being hurtful, like hurting others' feelings. I think it needs maybe a lot of enlightenment, like personally speaking, from my point of view, like it requires, I still feel not up to the level, like I'm very much maybe somewhere very down, like at the bottom. So reflecting on myself, I can say that, it needs like a lot of reading, understanding, reflecting maybe, and trying to understand others, accepting. I think it's high time. It's high time we got there as soon as possible to overcome maybe conflicts and to have a better, more peaceful world, I think.
Yes,
thank you very much.
No problem. Very significantly, you use a word, okay? Let me lay a certain amount of stress on that, you know, just to get some more clarity on the issue. You're using the word that obviously, I mean, the two kind of fears that might be there. One, that you might not be understood. That's one fear. The other fear is that you might be hurting the other. Now, this very fear of hurting, why should you be afraid of that? That is because you do not know where they're going to be hurt. All right. Now, how are you going to get to know that? You're only going to know that through interaction, through speaking, through listening, through conversing, through dialogue. That's where you're going to get it from. Okay, and if we do that, if we leave, as I'm saying, and we go into a post-secular society with the notion that that religion itself is not private, it can be discussed and can be public, and it is a public thing. Okay, then maybe this apprehensions, and I only call them apprehensions, they are apprehensions, and these apprehensions will disappear, because then you know where the actual boundaries are. One thing. Secondly, see, I have mentioned two terms in my lecture, antagonism and agonism. The difference between the two terms is important. Antagonism is where you feel antagonized by what the other is saying. Or you might even say things that might antagonize others. Or let us say you may say things which might unwittingly antagonize the others. Okay, this is the present situation. Liberal democracy does absolutely nothing to get rid of that situation. It is happy with this antagonism, because liberal democracy requires an enemy, which comes only through antagonism. It requires an agonistic so-and-so, okay? Antagonistic so-and-so, before it can actually survive. It has to lay blames of the system that it's building up on somebody else's head. It cannot say that I'm wrong. It has to say, oh, it's because of such and such, because of so-and-so. Okay, this is continuous rhetoric across liberal democracy, if you look at it. All right, so basically, agonism is a theory which basically suggests that no, you have to tolerate the difference. And tolerating the difference is not tolerance. They don't stick to tolerance. They're suggesting that you respect the other. And if you respect the other, you will tolerate the other. And if you tolerate the other, you will tolerate the views of the other. And therefore, antagonism is going to start to disappear, and agonism is going to come up, where agonism basically gets you into a kind of conversation, into speaking and listening, into understanding. Okay, rather than framing up a whole thing, you know, where you're actually developing antagonism, it's much better to have agonism. So, I mean, you've witnessed, I mean, world over, you know, kind of things that are going on with the houses of representatives, where they start to fling shoes, they start to hurt each other, they start to swear at each other, they even get into physical clashes, etc., etc. What's going on? Why can't you tolerate the view of the other? Why can't the other express himself or herself? Okay, so we are basically afraid, we are apprehensive that we might hurt somebody, because we do not know that somebody the way that we should actually be knowing it. And that is because that somebody with the view that he's got or whatever is confined to a private space. It's not in the public space. Yes? Okay. Go on.
Thank you very much. So it requires a lot of knowledge, right? So because we don't know, we cannot so it requires a set of maybe because I didn't know this much, I was not, so it requires readiness, so some level of knowledge. So what do you suggest? How it can be realized? How can it be spread to the as widely as possible? So we are very few people here. And
yeah.
maybe...
See, what you're saying basically is see, you're basically, sorry to say this, but you're basically not differentiating between prudence and knowledge, or let's say prudence and wisdom. All right, okay. Normally, what we understand by knowledge is basically what is otherwise termed prudence, as opposed to wisdom. All right. So let me just put that. I mean, what we require is not knowledge as such, We require an attitude. Now, where does this attitude come from? The earlier student, the question that was posed was interesting because, I mean, the person was talking about human nature. The present human nature is antagonistic. It does not tolerate the views of the other. We need to be agonistic, so we need to change the attitude. The society has to change its attitude. And if the society changes its attitude, this obviously what does change a society and its attitude is the way that the society is being governed, the way that the society is being organized. If we change the organization a little bit, the attitude will change. The attitude of the person living in that society will change. The attitudes as such will change. And if the attitudes change, because antagonism and agonism both are attitudes. They're not acquired knowledge as such. They're attitudes. Attitude is something that you're going to get, okay, with time. And I'm very sure that it's going to come through. It's not something that is very far away, I'm telling you. Maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in your lifetime, but definitely after that. Definitely after that. We cannot live on this planet without developing agonism as an attitude, because we'll have to learn to tolerate each other, that is, respect each other. Respecting is important. I respect you, you respect me, and then only we listen to each other, then only we speak to each other, then only we converse with each other, then only we dialogue with each other. We cannot do it otherwise. We can't do it. If there is no respect, if there's always this enemy who we do not respect, then how are we going to get through it? How are we going to get through a Christian thinking, oh, the Islamic people are really nasty. The Islamic people think, oh, look, these people are trying to dominate. This is all conflicting, right? So we need to move away from that as a society, not as an individual. I can change my attitude, you can change your attitude tomorrow. But then the entire society needs to change so that this question knowledge does not arise, okay? Let me give you an example out of this. I do not know. Where do you live? Where do you come from?
Kyrgyzstan, post-Soviet country.
Okay, all right. See, yeah, okay, all right. See, the thing is, I basically said that primarily because I don't know how politically you are aware, but let me relate this. See, during the Manmohan Singh government in India, Manmohan Singh was the person who was actually credited with bringing in neoliberalism into India, okay, with bringing in globalization, liberalization. The left parties, the communist parties of India, were supporting Manmohan Singh in his first win. There came an issue at a particular point that sufficient amount of electricity energy is not being produced in India so that it reaches to every man in India as such, okay? So they decided that they should have more invested into energy. And in that deliberation came up the notion that there is possibility of having nuclear energy and develop electricity out of that. Then there was an opposite and alternative point of view which said, okay, no, sorry, let's have gas turbines to produce electricity. Now the thing was that the nuclear group was very strong. Okay, it was basically Western-based group. Okay, which was out of business, especially with Chernobyl and all that. Okay, they were out of business. Okay, because obviously the fatality of using nuclear powers there in a country like India, obviously that is very much so, you know, with the kind of corruption that prevails in this country. Okay, you do not know what kind of building is going to be constructed, where all this is going to happen, when it's going to leak out, and how many people are going to just die. You know, I mean, we've seen the Bhopal gas tragedy and all that. You know, okay, so there was apprehension and there was alternative. The alternative was coming from Iran. Basically, Iran was willing to give a sufficient amount of gas. Now, the thing was that what Manmohan Singh and the government argued is, somebody said, okay, let's ask the people, let them decide. And the argument they presented was, look, I mean, this is something specialized, this is something that requires special knowledge, and therefore the common people cannot decide that. All right. Now, that's the thing here as well. Basically, is the society and its responsibility to ensure that the person actually has this thing. Okay, be that, call it attitude, call it knowledge, call it characteristic, whatever you like to call it. But it's the responsibility of the society as a whole. So Manmohan Singh government or any government cannot come up with this notion that, okay, these people are ignorant. Okay, I'm saying that deliberately because you asked that particular question, that these people are ignorant and therefore, you know, you require knowledge before you can actually, no, nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. This is something very common. We know what kind of disasters we can meet. The other thing that was more intricate than what I'm saying at the moment with regard to gas versus nuclear is the gas was quicker to produce the electricity and it was cheaper to produce electricity. So why go in for the nuclear? Obviously, the implication was quite clear that the big group of nuclear substance sellers were huge, and Manmohan Singh could not resist that. Right? So they left actually withdraw its support from the government. Okay, and the government went in for other small parties like Samajwadi Party and all those parties. I don't know how well you're aware, to actually manage its majority in the parliament and cobbled up some strength, which obviously created a lot of mess, which is why we are seeing at the moment fascist governments with BJP heading the entire thing. You know, I mean, that's what you're witnessing at the moment. This is a result of all those things. So it's not, what I'm saying is that it's not a divide between knowledge and not knowledge, knowledge and ignorance. It's not that. It's basically bringing things to the fore, bringing things into public debates, discursive discourses, let it be open, let people discuss, let things go on, let's have dialogues, let's have conversation, let's speak, let's listen, let's understand. Okay, let's bring in all those things. Okay, you cannot lay blame on knowledge or not knowledge. Knowledge is something, knowledge is an abstraction. Okay, it's only an abstraction. Practical man on the street, the everyday man on the street is not worried about knowledge. It's worried about how things are going to turn up to be, whether he can go into a place without feeling any kind of threat. Now, feeling threat, being apprehensive, being afraid, hurting, fear are all things that are existing in society. It's not something that people are not aware of. So if a person feels that they can go around, move around, say and do things that actually he thinks is right without any fear of being, let us say, killed or being, you know, assaulted, this and that, then obviously there'll be a freer society. You'll be able to converse and understand each other much better and change the attitudes as such. Okay? Does that explain? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I meant like awareness. How do we spread? Yeah, I mean,
how can we
awareness?
See,
however it was answered.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I didn't use the proper maybe word.
No, fine, no problem. No problem. Now we're getting into the actual thing. Yeah, okay. See, the thing is that I'm hostile to the very notion of liberalism. Okay, let me be very clear about it. See, you need to, at one point or another, change the way that the government functions, change the way that the society is organized. At one point or another. And if you do that, obviously there's going to be a change in the entire thing. Right? That's the only thing that I can say. Right? See, you can, I mean, any one individual cannot go out. Okay, and individualism itself is a liberal theory. Okay, an individual cannot go out and try and change the world as such. There's a lot more to it. I'm not suggesting that it evolves. There might be a slight revolution in the thinking itself. There's a possibility of that. So we can only, I mean, let us say, bring this about through a discourse, through open conversations. But that has to come about somehow or the other. And let us say in championing dialogue like Behzad is doing, this is one opening where we can actually start to do it, right?
Thank you.
Okay. Now, anything else? I mean, just go on. If you want to say something else, please.
So can I ask another question?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
A very naive understanding of political theory. I'm not a student of pol science at all.
Okay.
And so what, according to you, is not the best, but sort of like an ideal form of governance, in the sense, though it might be a very ignorant question, but
no, it's not an ignorant question. See, I'm a retired professor now.
Historically, things change, and it all is a response to the history and to the times we are in. But certain ideals and commonalities, I'm just curious to understand. Yes.
No, sure. See, there is no question that is small. There is no question that is not up to the mark. There's no question that is naive. All questions have an equal status, okay? And these questions basically suggest a kind of an exploration. That is what we are trying to do through, let us say, interfaith dialogue, or as I'm suggesting, and interreligious understanding. Okay, it's basically exploration, and exploration is something that we require, okay? Now, as far as what can be there as a political setup, that's what you're basically asking, okay? I mean, I should not be making any comments on that, okay? But anyway, let me try and say a little bit on that, okay? See, I hinted at this by suggesting that, I mean, at the moment, what do we have as part of the governance of the state? Look at any of these states. What we have is basically violence by the state. Okay, let me just go to Walter Benjamin, who's a philosopher. He was there around the time of Nazis, and he actually escaped from Germany and settled down somewhere in France, as far as I recall, or maybe Switzerland. Okay, he basically says that, violence are of two kinds, as far as this government and the state is concerned. There is what might be called the establishing of law. And when we talk about establishing of law, what we are suggesting is the establishing of a system. And the other violence that we have is basically the maintenance of that law. Now, the second kind of violence is far more dangerous, because that is not giving the freedom to think. It's basically suppressing you. And that's why I said in my lecture that in future, at least I expect, is that governments are not going to depend on power. It's not going to depend on violence to maintain and contain. It should actually depend on trying to address the dissents, and should actually itself work as a group of resistance to various kinds of ills that might be coming into the society. I visualize a society where people could live with each other. The task of the government should be to ensure that nobody is hurt, okay, which is a liberal point of view, basically. But I mean, that is a good point of view, and we should actually include it in that. Because if you look at John Stuart Mill, basically what he's saying is that you're allowed all the liberty in the world that you want to, so long as you do not hurt anybody, obviously the question arises, what kind of hurt do you mean? Is it physical hurt or is it something beyond that? Okay. But anyway, keeping it, the whole thing sort of slightly brief, basically, it's a matter of allowing the people the freedom to think and not be indulged. It's a government which actually is part of the resistance of the evils that come into the society. Try and basically dissent from that, to agree to dissent, to listen to dissent. Okay, this will be a kind of a democratic setup that we all of us visualize, and that is what I visualize as future. And if we don't have that as a future, then we're going to have a very nasty, very dystopic kind of a future. And I shudder to actually even think of that. Does that explain it?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for really highlighting this, violence and its manifestations in our everyday realities. And if that can be politically addressed, which so many philosophers have done. But yes, thank you very much, sir, for that.
Thank you for the question.
Anybody else with a question or comment?
Actually, when Behzad actually asked me for the topic, the title of the topic, I gave him the title, but then I said that this might be slightly controversial, but I don't see any controversies being generated from it. I would like some controversies to come up. Do criticize it, do hammer into it, do try and kill it.
So let me try.
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
Question. A hadith goes by the Prophet. Yeah. So you are governed as the way you are, like according to your attitude. Maybe like if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I'm just trying to convey the meaning of the hadith. So it means so government or elected government is like representing the people. So how can we reflect? So how can we accord this?
Yeah. Can you repeat the hadith again, please? Sorry.
So you are governed the way you are, like government is representative of the people. So if people are violent, violent people will come to the government or like to the governance.
Yeah, we're witnessing that everywhere.
How should we relate? Yeah,
no, we're witnessing that hadith everywhere. Yeah, that's what we're talking about basically. But let me put it another way. Let me try and clarify. Let's see, what we have in the Quran is what is being said by God. Okay. Hadith is not something that starts off with the Prophet. Hadith is a traditional aspect of the Arabic society. Hadith basically means of what is coming from the elders. Okay, and that which was coming from elders in the tribal life basically meant that was sacrosanct and nobody could violate it, right? With the Quran there, obviously, and the Quran itself declaring, Allah himself declaring that Muhammad is just another among you, that means he is there. So, I mean, you don't have to agree with Muhammad everywhere. Therefore, hadith is a matter of choice. All right? Am I clear on that? It's a matter of choice whether you agree with it or you may not agree with it. You have the choice. I mean, whereas you don't have that choice as far as the Quran is concerned. All right, okay. Given that, okay, let me put it this way. See, you are governed the way you are, absolutely right. Because the entire society is made up by you. Okay, but that was true at a particular point in time. That's not true today with these kind of hegemonic governments that we have, the kind of shackles that we are being tied in. Everywhere I see men in change. Okay, what's his name? Yeah, okay. Basic, yeah, I think Behzad would give me the name, just slipping my memory. It says that man was born free, but I see everyone in chain. Who is that?
Rousseau.
Out of the three contracts, yeah. Sorry?
It was Rousseau.
Yeah, Rousseau, sorry, yeah, just slipped my memory altogether. Yeah, okay, Rousseau. Okay, so basically, we were born free to decide what we want to be. Okay, to decide how we are going to be governed. But that's not the case today. We don't have any decisions. We don't have any way of deciding in way. I mean, let's put it this way, we have little choice. Do you have a choice? Let's say in the American system between the Republican and the Democrats, what's the difference? Both of them are proponents of the same ideology, the ideology of the capitalists. What's the difference? Where's the difference? Any other kind of ideology is suppressed immediately. Trump went to the extreme of actually putting down, any kind of the other, be that Mexicans, be that Muslims, be that anybody. So what kind of a choice do we have? We don't have a choice anymore. Okay, we can take the historical blame on us, but that is a historical blame and say, this is what we have created for ourselves. Yes, absolutely right. No problem in that. But then let's put it this way. If this is the way that we have created, this is what we have created for ourselves, and we are basically governed the way that we are, then let's change ourselves. But then that will be, what that is basically suggesting is that individual is going to change, which is liberal aspect. Liberal philosophy basically requires the individual to do things. It doesn't require, because it's a philosophy about individual, about a singularity, about a single individual. A single individual who is isolated, right? It's not about a community, it's not about a totality. So maybe we need to do is to think in terms of totality. We need to think the total. Maybe then we can find a way out of this. If we don't think the total, because if we don't think the total, we do not understand it. So we need to think the total. And when we think the total, then only we can understand it, and then only maybe we are in a position to change it and bring in a government the way that we are. We are not like this government, like say, for example, in India. Okay, what kind of a government do we have? We have a fascist government. They're not fascists. I think 70% of the Indian population is not fascist. So there's something wrong with this majoritarian kind of notion of democracy. But how do we change it? That's the system that is there. We are part of it. We are made of it. Nobody would budge an inch. But then, if we start to think in terms of totality, I'm talking about totalitarianism. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about totality. You look at the whole world, you look at the way that things are moving, the way that things are being done, then maybe we can think the way that things should be done. That liberal principle should be held that, okay, every individual has the right to think and to decide the way that he or she would like to be. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so agreeing with the hadith, I'm suggesting something that might be actually embedded in the hadith. Okay, it might be embedded in this very hadith, that you need to actually bring about a change. All right, so obviously we moved from the pagan state to the Islamic state. Okay, because we brought about a revolution. It was a revolution, there's absolutely no doubt about that. It changed all the relations that were possible, social relations that were possibly there. It is a massive change. It's not a small change. It was a sudden change. It did not happen gradually. It did not take centuries. Okay, so we may need a similar kind of revolution again in order to change the society that we live in, so that things actually come through the way that we want, and actually we are governed the way that we are or we would like to be. Yeah? Does that help you a little bit more?
Thank you. Yeah, when we look at back what happened, yeah, it might be called revolution because of its it happened over a very short period of time. But we also noticed that civil activism, yeah. So it happened it started with one,
yeah,
and spread very quickly.
Exactly.
So one another, then a geometric kind of growing.
Right. I mean, virtually huge proportions, moving out. Yeah, sure.
And also,
something like that.
Of course,
now.
it required a lot of faith and action.
Yeah, sure.
Discussion, persuasion,
yeah,
dialogues. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean, imagine the amount of discussion that Muhammad must have gone through. Huge, And obviously, it's not something that he just got, let us say after prophethood. I mean, he got a lot of it even before that, He was a very intelligent man. I mean, he was a genius par excellence. I mean, nobody can deny that, okay? His comprehension of things was phenomenal, okay? Therefore, he could bring about. I'm not suggesting that each one of us, I mean, we should try and be like him. We should take him to be an example. I'm not suggesting that even following him and taking him as an example, we can actually manage it. We will not, but we should actually try and do that. Why not? That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay, and a little clarification about hadith.
Yep.
The one I told is it's words of the prophet. Yeah, it's not a tradition coming from maybe previous generations. And
no,
also,
I know that. I know that. No, I was just explaining the term hadith itself. Okay. Yeah.
Right. The same Quran says that prophet, even if his words, some of his words were not contained in the Quran, but Quran says he never speaks of himself. So it means all of his thinking, all of his guidance.
Yes,
he
agreed,
speaks only
agreed.
Of God.
Yeah.
So he
agreed.
gets some kind of approval by God, even if it's not contained in the Quran. It is kind of from God. Yeah.
Yeah. See, what you're saying is all right. I accept that. There's no problem in that. But the thing is that, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, whatever hadiths are, they get us to understand the Quran better. All right, okay. But what I'm suggesting here is not, I mean, I'm not saying that hadiths are not to be followed or hadiths should not be followed. I'm suggesting that hadiths nevertheless is optional, okay? However, I mean, like this hadith, I mean, this is something that is full of wisdom and we should follow it. Why should we not follow it? I don't see any reason for not following it. Why should we not change the way that we are governed? This is what this hadith is saying. He's saying that you should choose your own way of getting governed. You should not leave it to other people. You should not leave it to fate. You should not leave it to history. You should decide the history itself. That's what this hadith is saying. It's an important hadith. It is a hadith to be followed. Okay? I mean, you know that there are a lot of hadiths that are basically rejected, as not being, maybe, not being authentic. We know that, okay? So obviously there's always this question mark of authenticity. So we have to use our own rationality for that. We have to use our own understanding of things before we start to follow anything at all, All right? I mean, in fact, even the Quran, I mean, Allah requires that you understand. That's why He's given your mind to think. Okay, He wants you to understand before you start to follow it. So we need to understand the significance, the meaning, the history, the place that it was taking place, the entire idea behind it before we can start to actually follow it. And I mean, obviously these at one time, I was even thinking, now I don't have the time for it. I was even thinking of actually working out, and bringing out all the hadiths, which I think are very relevant to the present time. All right, and bring it out and compile it. Okay, that's some work that can always be done, and it's going to be extremely useful piece of work. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Yep.
All right. Anyone else? If we don't have any more questions or comments, maybe, sir, we can conclude here. Or if you want to add something finally.
No, I'm delighted. I'm very happy with the interactive session. I might have kept my lecture brief, but then I've always depended on interaction in order to get through, because that is what actually brings things into focus, and it's far more important than just delivering a lecture or a longish lecture. And then a longish lecture gets very boring as well anyway. But I'm very happy to see the kind of questions that are coming in, which basically gives me a feeling that the people who are joining your group are people who are willing to think, who are actually looking at the future. They are actually hypothecating for themselves. They're actually trying to work out implications of things. They are what I'll call, with an inverted commas, thinking human beings. There aren't very many of them. Let me quote Bertrand Russell on that. Bertrand Russell's quotation is that if only a man would stop and think for a moment, comma, then he goes on to say, but a moment is a very long time and thinking a very difficult process. Shall I repeat that? If only a man would stop and think for a moment, but then a moment is a very long time and thinking a very difficult process. But if only a moment, it only requires a moment of thought to see things, to apprehend them, to comprehend them, to work on them, to understand them. You only require a moment. But then in this busy life that we are leading, in this kind of dictated life, alien to ourselves that we are leading, we don't get that kind of time. We should actually bring that time out for ourselves. We should actually create that space for ourselves and start to think, start to converse, start to dialogue in order to get through, because we are at a very difficult time. We're at a juncture in history where either the history is going to go one way, where there's going to be governments after governments who are going to dominate and tell us how to behave, or we're going to have our freedom. That's why I said in the opening of my lecture that we are living at a very perplexed time of human freedom. All right. Thank you.
All right, sir. Thank you. I know you have a lot, you're busy with a lot of things, but despite that, you took time out for us. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this.
It was such a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for you to invite me over. Extremely grateful. Thank you very much.